The Silencing of Women and Silent Spring. This is an extremist book, written in a situation of extremity, written on the edge of a culture that is killing itself and all of sentient life. The tree of life has been replaced by the necrophilic symbol of a dead body hanging on dead wood. The Godfather insatiably demands more sacrifices, and the fundamental sacrifices of pseudo-spiritual religion are female. The sacrificing of women requires the silencing of women, which takes place in myriad ways, in a maze of ways. A basic pattern of these ways is self-splitting, which is initiated by the patriarchally powerful, and which the victims internalize and continue to practice within the caste of women. Women are silenced/split by the babble of grammatical usage. Subliminal and subtle self-splitting is achieved by the very pronouns we are trained to use to designate ourselves. Julia Stanley and Susan Robbins have written of the peculiar history of the pronoun she, which was introduced into Middle English as a late development. During the Middle Ages, he had come to be both the female and the male pronoun. After she was introduced, it referred only to females, while he became, quote, generic, allegedly including women. This transition in the history of the pronoun he was hardly insignificant. Quote, since the pronoun always designates females, while the male pronoun designates all humans as well as males, patriarchal language as manifested in the pronominal system of English extended the scope of maleness to include humanity, while restricting femaleness to, quote, the other, who is, by implication, non-human. Any speaker internalizing such language unconsciously internalizes the values underlying such a system, thus perpetuating the cultural and social assumptions necessary to maintain the patriarchal power structure. End quote. When women become aware of the manipulable ambiguity of the pronoun he, we have perceived only the foreground of grammatical silencing techniques. Just as it would be a mistake to fixate upon the pseudo-generic man and assume that terms such as people and person are, quote, real generics, a falsehood disclosed by such expressions as, quote, people and their wives, end quote, so it is a mistake to fixate upon the third-person singular. As Monique Wittig has shown, the pronoun I conceals the sexual identity of the speaker/writer. The I makes the speaker/writer deceptively feel at home in a male-controlled language. When she uses this pronoun, she may forget that she is buried in the false generic he. The fact is that the female saying I is alien at every moment to her own speaking and writing. She is broken by the fact that she must enter this language in order to speak or to write. As the quote I is broken, so is the inner I, the capacity for integrity of knowing/sensing. In this way, the inner voice of the self's integrity is silenced. The external voice babbles in alien and alienating tongues. And when the self tries to speak out of her true depths, the pedantic peddlers of, quote, correct usage and style try to drown it in their babble. Women are silenced/split by the embedding of fears. These contrived and injected fears function in a manner analogous to electrodes implanted into the brain of a victim, quote, patient, who can be managed by remote control. This is a kind of, quote, silent control, as silent as the pushing of a button. Women may feel that they are free from certain fears, quote, liberated, and then bend to the unacknowledged power of these fears with mental knee-jerk responses. A brief analysis of responses to a few of these instilled fears should unmask the methods of, quote, silent control, which silence the voices of women's deep selves, while allowing the, quote, liberated false selves to babble freely. For example, the cliché, quote, she lacks a sense of humor, end quote, applied by men to every threatening woman, is one basic, quote, electrode embedded just deeply enough into the fearful foreground of women's psyches to be able to conduct female energy against the self while remaining disguised. The comment is urbane, insidious. It is boring and predictable if seen through, devastating if believed. The problem is that the victim who, quote, sees through this dirty trick on one level may, quote, believe the judgment literally on more vulnerable levels. It is perfectly consistent with patriarchal patterns that this device is used especially against the wittiest women, who are dismissed as, quote, sharp-tongued. The godfather is the father of lies and favors the most blatant lies. In the land of the fathers, the more blatant the lie, the greater its credibility, for it is then most consistent with the general pattern of bizarre beliefs. Our ability to overcome the power of such particular fear-instilling lies depends on our ability to discern the pattern of the whole. Gaian ecology requires a constant effort to see the interconnectedness of things. It involves seeing the totality of the lie which is patriarchy, unweaving its web of deception. Since the totality of the patriarchal lie is not integrity, since it lacks the complexity of real integrity, it tends to fall apart quickly once we see its pattern, once we dare to face, quote, the whole thing. Moreover, since it depends entirely upon the reality which it distorts and demonically reflects, our seeing through patriarchy is at the same time learning to see the background, our stolen integrity/energy/being. Once we are tuned to the fact of instilled fears and of how they are used to keep women in line, we can detect the patterns over and over again. As we isolate each fear and examine it, we can see that our overcoming it depends upon seeing it in context, seeing through the whole thing. Consider, for example, the instilled fear of becoming like one's mother, matrophobia. Repeatedly, we find daughters who repudiate the particular kind of victimization they see in their mothers' lives, only to live and die out an apparently opposite, but really only slightly variant form of the same disease. For example, the life of a Cosmo girl as opposed to that of a staid suburban housewife. Embedded fears of being labeled, quote, sick, quote, selfish, or, quote, sexless all function in similar ways. If the victim does not see the pattern, she will react to the particulars by becoming mindlessly, quote, normal, murderously, quote, selfless, and moronically, quote, sexy. In these various ways, her self is silenced. Fear of the label, quote, lesbian has driven many into matrimony, mental hospitals, and worst of all, numbing, dumbing normality. It has driven others into heterosexist, quote, gay pride protests, promoted by and for men, into butch femme matings modeled on matrimony, into aping the genital fixations of porn peddlers, pimps, priests. Lesbians/spinsters/Amazons/survivors can defeat the embedded fears only by acknowledging the total context of deception plotted by the male supremacist scriptwriters. Spinning, amazing, surviving is coming out of the shadows into a fullness of light, which reduces the, quote, spotlights of the father's fixations to invisibility/impotence. In her own light, the self sees/says her own light/insight. She sees through the lurid male masturbatory fantasies about made-up, quote, lesbians who make out in Playboy for men's amusement. The self expels them, together with other embedded, quote, seminal ideas. Images of the macho female prison guard, the, quote, rejected old maid, the bad mother, the, quote, happy bunny bride, the totaled woman. All are interconnected implanted fears and can be silenced only when women dare to see the connections among them and to see/name ourselves. Overcoming the silencing of women is an extreme act, a sequence of extreme acts. Breaking our silence means living in existential courage. It means discovering our deep sources, our spring. It means finding our native resiliency, springing into life, speech, action. Many years ago, Rachel Carson published her book, Silent Spring. She was an early prophet foretelling ecological disaster. Her book was greeted with noise and babble, but despite the awards and praise, essentially it received the silent treatment. Like the mythic Cassandra, who was cursed by Apollo, quote, the god of truth, to be disbelieved when she prophesied the truth, Rachel Carson, whose credibility was weakened by her sex, was greeted with superficial attention and deep inattentiveness. Ecologists today still deny her recognition, maintaining dishonest silence. Meanwhile, the springs are becoming more silent, as the necrophilic leaders of phallotechnic society are carrying out their programs of planned poisoning for all life on the planet. I am not suggesting that women have a, quote, mission to save the world from ecological disaster. I am certainly not calling for female self-sacrifice in the male-led cause of, quote, ecology. I am affirming that those women who have the courage to break the silence within ourselves are finding/creating/spiraling a new spring. This spring within us and among us makes being possible, and makes the process of integrity possible. For it puts us in touch with the intuition of being, which Jan Raymond has called the intuition of integrity. This intuitive, dynamic integrity enables us to begin seeing through the mad reversals which have been our mind findings. It empowers us to question the sacred and secular, quote, texts which have numbed our brains by implanting, quote, answers before we had a chance to question and to quest. Our discovery of the spring within us enables us to begin asking the right questions. There is no other way to begin. The hope which springs when women's deep silence, the silence that breaks us, is broken is the hope of saving ourselves, of delivering ourselves from the sins of the fathers, and moving on from there. Since this spring of women's being is powerfully attractive to our own kind, womankind, we communicate it even without trying. Thus, by breaking the imposed silence, we hope to spring other prisoners of patriarchy whose biophilic tendencies have not been completely blighted and blocked. The point is not to save society or to focus on escape, which is backward-looking, but to release the spring of being. To the inhabitants of Babel, this spring of living speech will be unintelligible. If it is heard at all, it will be dismissed as mere babble, as the muttering of mad crones. So much the better for the crone's chorus. Left undisturbed, we are free to find our own concordance, to hear our own harmony, the harmony of the spheres. The purpose, the method, the style of this book. Writing this book is participating in feminist process. This is problematic, for isn't a book by its definition a, quote, thing, an objectification of thinking/imagining/speaking? Here is a book in my hand, fixed, solid. Perhaps, hopefully, its author no longer wholly agrees with it. It is, at least partially, her past. The dilemma of the living/verbing writer is real. But much of the problem resides in the way books are perceived. If they are perceived/used/idolized as sacred texts, like the Bible or the writings of Chairman Mao, then of course the idolaters are caught on a wheel that turns but does not move. They, quote, spin, like wheels on ice, a, quote, spinning that in no way resembles feminist process. We cannot avoid this static kind of, quote, spinning wheel by becoming anti-literate, anti-cerebral. Quote, feminist anti-intellectualism is a mere reaction against moralizing masculinist education and scholarship, and it is a trap. We need creative crystallizing in the sense of producing works such as books. Like crystal balls, glowing globes, these help us to foretell the future and to discover the past, for they further the process itself by transforming the previously unknown into that which we explicitly know, and therefore can reflect upon, criticize. Thus they spark new visions. This creative crystallizing is a translation of feminist journeying, of our encounters with the unknown, into a chrysalis. This writing/metamorphosing/spinning is itself part of the journey, and the chrysalis, the incarnation of experience in words, is a living, changing reality. It is the transmission of our transitions. Feminist process must become sensible in actions, speech, works of all kinds, in order to become. The journey requires the courage to create, that we may learn from lucid criticism, that we may remember the dismembered body of our heritage, that we may stop repeating the same mistakes. Patriarchal erasure of our tradition forces us to relearn what our foresisters knew, and to repeat their blunders. The warped mirror image of creative hagiography is standard patriarchal scholarship, which merely researches and recovers, quote, women's history. Insofar as this book is true to its original impulse, It is a written rebuttal of the right of right research. It is part of the metapatriarchal journeying of women. Hopefully, it will not merely, survive as a thing, a noun, but will spin as a verb, as a gynocentric manifestation of the intransitive verb. Elsewhere, I have advocated committing the crime of methodicide, since the methodolatry of patriarchal disciplines kills creative thought. The acceptable/unexceptional circular reasonings of academics are caricatures of motion. The "products" are more often than not a set of distorted mirrors, made to seem plausible through the mechanisms of male bonding. On the boundaries of the male-centered universities, however, there is a flowering of woman-centered thinking. Gynocentric method requires not only the murder of misogynistic methods, intellectual and affective exorcism, but also ecstasy, which I have called lucid cerebration. This is, the free play of intuition in our own space, giving rise to thinking that is vigorous, informed, multidimensional, independent, creative, tough. It arrives from the lived experiences of being. Being is the verb that says the dimensions of depth in all verbs, such as intuiting, reasoning, loving, imaging, making, acting, as well as the couraging, hoping, and playing that are always there when one is really living. Gynocentric writing means risking. Since the language and style of patriarchal writing simply cannot contain or carry the energy of women's exorcism and ecstasy, in this book I invent, discover, remember. At times I make up words, such as gynesthesia, for women's synesthesia. Often I unmask deceptive words by dividing them and employing alternate meanings for prefixes. For example, recover actually says, cover again. I also unmask their hidden reversals, often by using less known or, obsolete meanings. For example, glamour as used to name a witch's power. Sometimes I simply invite the reader to listen to words in a different way. For example, delight. When I play with words, I do this attentively, deeply, paying attention to the etymology, to varied dimensions of meaning, to deep background meanings and subliminal associations. There are some woman-made words which I choose not to use for various reasons. Sometimes I reject words that I think are inauthentic, obscuring women's existence and masking the conditions of our oppression. For example, chairperson. In other cases, my choice is a matter of intuitive judgment. For example, my decision not to use herstory. At times I have been conscious of breaking almost into incantations, chants, alliterative lyrics. At such moments, the words themselves seem to have a life of their own. They seem to want to break the bonds of conventional usage, to break the silence imposed upon their own backgrounds. They become palpable, powerful, and it seems that they are tired of allowing me to, use them and cry out for a role reversal. I become their mouthpiece, and if I am not always accurate in conveying their meanings, it is probably because I haven't yet learned to listen closely enough in the realm of the labyrinth inner ear. Another delicate area has been the use of pronouns, especially the choice between we and they to refer to women. Elsewhere, I have stressed the importance of the pronoun we and avoided the objective they. Obviously, there are times when the use of the word we would be absurd. For example, when referring to the women of ancient Greece. However, there are other instances when I have to play pronoun usage by ear. As the journey progresses, and as the extent of the risk of radical feminism becomes more evident, it becomes clear that there are women, including some who would describe themselves as, feminists, with whom I do not feel enough identification to warrant the pronoun we. Sometimes, since the ambiguity about whether or not to use we or they is not clearly resolvable, there are difficult choices. Since pronouns are profoundly personal and political, they carry powerful messages. Despite the fact that many writers and readers ignore this pronomial power, subliminal clues are transmitted and received. At times, my choice of we or they is a means of realizing my identification with or separation from certain roles and behaviors. At other times, I use these pronouns interchangeably in reference to the same subject out of a sense of balance, which is simply, playing by ear. My use of capitalization is, quote, irregular, conforming more to my meaning than to standard usage. For example, I consistently capitalize spinster, just as one normally capitalizes Amazon. I capitalize lesbian when the word is used in its woman-identified, correct sense, but the lowercase when referring to the male-distorted version reflected in the media. Self is capitalized when I am referring to the authentic center of women's process, while the imposed/internalized false quote self, the shell of the self, is in lowercase. In writing of the deep background which is the divine depth of the self, I capitalize, while the term foreground, referring to surface consciousness, generally is not capitalized. I have not created or followed rigid rules about this matter, but simply have tried to convey meaning accurately/forcefully. Thus, when I write state of possession, the capitals are meant to convey that this is not only an individual or internal condition, but a kind of society. At times, I choose not to capitalize when this would be required by standard usage. The reader will see what I mean when she encounters such an expression as the patriarchal God, in contrast with the God-Father. I have no need to consistently capitalize Christian or God, being much more inclined to capitalize crone or goddess. This is obviously a matter of not only, quote, taste, but evaluation. I generally do not bother to change proper names, which are conventionally capitalized. Thus, I relegate such cases as the terms Apollo, Christ, and Zeus to their conventional upper cases. One could spend too much energy worrying about such matters. As Gertrude Stein remarked, quote, sometimes one feels that Italians should be with a capital, and sometimes with a small letter. One can feel like that about almost anything. End quote. I do not generally put the terms feminine and masculine in quotation marks. I use both of these terms to refer to roles/stereotypes/sets of characteristics which are essentially distorted and destructive to the self, and to her process and environment. Thus, if the terms feminine and masochist are used synonymously, this has nothing to do with the deep reality of the female self, but with patriarchally imposed, self-denying masks. There is also the matter of the use of sources. The primary sources of this book are women's experiences, past and present. Its secondary sources are male-authored texts from many, quote, fields. I use the latter in various ways. Sometimes I use them to expose their limitations, to display and exercise their deceptions. Sometimes I use them as springboards. At all times I am acutely aware that most of these books and articles were written at the expense of women, whose energies were drained and ideas freely and shamelessly taken over. The following, quote, acknowledgments from Edwin Newman's Strictly Speaking are slightly more obvious than the average, but convey the typical situation. Quote, this book is dedicated to my wife and daughter. My wife's contributions have been so many and so varied that it is not possible to list them. There would be no book without her. My daughter supplied many suggestions, much encouragement, and through the years, tolerance of my kind of humor, above and beyond the call of duty. Jeanette Hopkins provided the impetus for the book and edited it. Carol Bach did the typing and the research. To both of them, my deep thanks. Mary Heathcote was the invaluable copy editor. End quote. As Andre Collard has said of male authors, quote, he not only copies her ideas, he also holds the copyright. End quote. Finally, I must add that in using male sources, at no point have I acted in the position of, quote, disciple, citing an authority. I have tried righteously to use the materials available to me under the prevailing conditions, deploring, as scholars should, the necessity for resorting to such secondary resources.